So I'd like to ask you a little bit about the background to this novel, maybe going back, kind of even looking more broadly than at this specific novel, because you write in so many different forms, I want to say. How do you know, how does a kind of story rise up at you, and you know with this one that you're going to set it, and I want to say, if it doesn't bother you, a kind of a version of the real world, of the world we know?
Yeah, it's easier than it looks in a sense, because I tend to split the output quite precisely into that which is clearly based in a version of the real world and that which is clearly based somewhere else. And so I already know, in a way, the moment I get an idea where it comes from, because it will come out of the trains of thought that are associated with those two. As far as I'm concerned, the two possibilities. Within that, there's a lot of differentiation. And there are novels like Light, which take place both in a fairly realistic version of our world and you know, the very far future. So both areas of my interest take place in one book there. But also, I've always thought that the way to make fantasy fiction in particular, and horror fiction and ghost stories in particular, the way to make those stick as far as the reader's concerned is to set them in the most realistic mise en scene that you can manage. And that basically you should try and write them out of your own experience. And certainly your own experience in the sense of the experience of walking down the street or sitting in a room or eating in a restaurant. I don't see why you should get those things wrong just because you're writing a fantasy. You should get those things right precisely because you're writing a fantasy. That way, at the end of it, in a story that's set reasonably in our world, the shock is greater for the reader. And that's, after all, what you're after. You're, especially in popular fiction, in commercial fiction, you're after some kind of surprise for the reader.
That's interesting, and that makes me think of, and this book made me think of, because of the way it's embedded in landscape, but that makes me think of a writer I'm a great admirer of, is Alan Garner, whose works of fantasy are so closely embedded in a tiny square of landscape, really, in Cheshire, and they have that great power. For that, I just want to interject and say that I want to, of course, invite questions from you, our audience. Please, as they occur to you, type them into the Q&A box. I will keep an eye on them, and then as we speak, I will relay them to Mike. So don't hesitate. I won't keep all the questions to the end. Just if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will come round to them. Well, maybe for those of our audience who haven't actually yet had the treat of reading The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again, tell us a little bit about it and kind of where it came from and what you feel it is.
Yes. That, of course, is always difficult to know where to start to answer that one. In terms of its narrative and its, as it were, story, it's a love story written in such a way as to show the two lovers as so self-centered. I don't think self-involved is the word, or narcissistic is the word, but certainly self-centered. That they not only fail to make a relationship, but they also fail to notice the elephant in the room, which is that there has been some kind of invasion of the human genome by fish genes. And the world is changing around them, and they are simply not noticing that. And obviously the point of that is fairly ironic, fairly satirical, and fairly determinedly aimed at the situation we find ourselves in now. So that's the basic story. Why it's like it is because I wanted to write something that was not science fiction or fantasy or horror or mainstream or literary, all of those things together. And that was the only medium I could think of to do it in, basically. So it's an attempt to write what somebody called a realist fantasy. And really, I think this is the circle that I've been trying to square my entire career, is to write something which is both fantastic and real at the same time.
And I suppose I feel, and I think you've said something kind of like this in relation perhaps to the work of J.G. Ballard. I mean, I feel that, and we referred to the momentousness of today, that this novel felt very prescient to me. The world seems to become more and more fantastic to me. And one of the things that was most powerful about this book was this atmosphere of rumor and kind of dread that I feel we all kind of inhabit more and more now as we're in all this noise. It's fascinating what you say about the two, Shaw and Victoria, their kind of lack of awareness of what is going on around them.
When I started it, I felt very much that I felt that dread myself quite early. My journal is full of notes saying something's going on. I don't like the feel of the world at the moment, you know, but I can't say what it is because frankly, I'm too interested in something else I'm doing. And that's what gave me the idea, is this sense you have on almost, this would almost be a kind of Freudian sense you have of understanding something that you don't quite yet perceive. And then suddenly we were all able to perceive it in about 2015. You know, we knew what was happening suddenly. But prior to that, I was fascinated by that feeling that things were changing, but you didn't quite know how. You knew that it was linked to obsessive use of conspiracy theory in the kind of the world's imagination. And I felt that for many years, maybe 2 or 3 decades, that the whole world has lived with the act of fantasy as its epistemology. Everything we've done or thought has been somehow filtered through the fantasies that we have, the fantasies of advertising, the fantasies of politics, and so on and so forth. And so it was a way of bringing that out as well. This sense, I think most of us back in, you mentioned the old New Wave days, the old New Worlds days, and Ballard. I think these were ideas we were having way back in the mid-60s. This real sense that we weren't quite getting a handle on the world, and that part of the job of fantastic fiction was to bring out that sense. Call it paranoia, if you will, but you know.
But I wonder if, you know, referring back to those New Wave days, and because you've had this extraordinary long career, and technologies have changed, the way that we communicate has changed. You yourself, I know now, I follow you on Twitter. I wonder if you feel that even though you've had this sense of dread, of premonition from the time you started writing, how you feel that's altered over the course of your career. Has it become more pressing, more difficult? challenging to address in writing, or is the fact that it seems to me more out in the open, does that make your job easier?
I think it diffuses the job to a degree, especially in around things like the environment. Back then, it was a very minority concern, and you were trying to sell a pretty unknown bill of goods to people. Whereas now, everybody is very concerned, and to a degree, I don't think it's not necessary for science fiction writers to write warnings about what might happen to the environment. I mean, we're past that stage. We need to think of something else to do. And in fact, I think many science fiction writers, and indeed many writers, many of the writers involved with XR and XR Rebellion, are trying to find brand new ways of talking about these things, which will allow for the fact that two things are happening. Is, as you say, the public awareness is now huge, but at the same time, the problem has got worse. And so, I mean, that doesn't quite suit my way of writing, which is essentially kind of, I like to deal with the hidden. I like to deal with that which is occluded. And these things are no longer occluded. They're kind of not my subject matter anymore. So I need to change. Every so often I write a note to myself, which goes, change, Mike, change. I think every concern that I now see in modern politics was already visible back then. I don't believe that Ballard, for instance, ever predicted technological change. What he was interested in was the psychological change that preceded the use of a particular technology. And I think that's what we all did in the new wave, and that's what the best of modern science fiction always does. Whenever you make your cut down, if you make your cut down in 1906, it's H.G. Wells. He's not talking about the technology itself. He's talking about the motives of human beings that make use of the technology, or who could make. But if it's new technology, then these are the uses that might be made of it. This is the kind of extrapolative function of that kind of science fiction. Again, that's not my interest. I've never tried to predict the future. I think it's hard enough to predict the present, which is what SF writers really do. What we really do is we talk about the present all the time.
Tell us, before I'll invite you to read a little bit in a moment, but maybe tell us a little bit, one of the things I loved most, so many things I loved about this novel, but was the sense of landscape in it. And you have these two landscapes, kind of West London landscape, and then a landscape around where you are now in Shropshire. Maybe can you talk a little bit about the role that landscape plays in this book, and perhaps in your work in general?
Probably better to talk about it in general, in a sense. As a small boy, I spent most of my time outdoors in landscapes. And I spent much of that time just staring at things. I can still remember staring at a spring in the middle of a field, just a little very clear puddle with the water welling up into it, and sitting there for 2 or 3 hours in the sunshine, just watching the water. I've got to start there, because I think that underpins everything I've done since. It seems to me that everything comes out of landscape. That landscape can be any kind of landscape. It can be a cityscape, it can be rural, it can be a desert. The nature of a given landscape doesn't really matter, except in as much as what is generated by it in terms of human behavior and what I can only think of as the spiritual, in a sense, I'm a complete atheist, but I believe that somehow we are the landscape. So everything I've ever done has always come up out of a landscape to start with. What attracted me so much to the new wave of science fiction was I saw people who were beginning to do that, who were beginning to really look around them, not set stories in the same old invented worlds, but looking at our own world and bringing the fiction up out of that. At the same time, I was reading huge amounts of 20th and 30th writers, literary writers, who were welling up out of one kind of landscape or another in Great Britain, or travel writers who were looking at things. It's so important to look if you're going to write. To me, it seems you have to look to start with. And so, to me, there's not a huge amount of difference between a so-called invented landscape, which of course they never are. You make them up from bits that you already know, and a photographically described actual landscape. And so, for me, there's no difference between the landscapes in Light, really, and the landscapes in Climbers. Climbers was written to be a photographic record of the Peak District, almost. It was written to have more realism in the conveying of the outdoors than the acts of people in the outdoors. I was more interested in the pictures, in the kind of landscape painting. I think there's also this Gothic element, isn't there? That essentially Gothic writers could learn to do so much with landscape. You can use the landscape to convey all sorts of things that would bore the reader if you put it into the mouths of the characters. You can use the pathetic fallacy to absolutely, you can ramp it up 100% and really, go for it. So I use that a lot as well. And I think that my decision with the Sunken Land was to go 100% full tilt for the kind of gothicity of the landscape, which I'll read this little bit, which I think will back that up as a statement.
I think that's a perfect way to lead in. So why don't we have a little bit of a reading? I will switch my camera off while you read. So take it away.
Okay. This is a very short piece. If I can get my other computer to come up here, which should take exactly 5 minutes to read. It's just a little excerpt which beds the novel into its landscape. At that time of year, you could almost hear the water rising under everything. It filled the ancient drains and the subcellars. It filled the capped wells and forgotten sewerage culverts, the late 18th century mining galleries and goaths abandoned beneath the early Victorian townhouses, the half-closed shafts that opened suddenly in people's gardens, proving upon examination to be choked with lumps of worthless penny stone, like fossilized children's heads, stealthily but determinedly forcing its way, as it did winter after winter, between the layered mazes of the old workings. Nothing down there could really be said to flow. Nevertheless, the groundwater rose and fell. It dripped and seeped. It percolated through the fractured beds beneath the coppices, through the demented, unpredictable, immeasurably fortunate geology of that place, fuel for the industrial light and magic that had once changed the world. The iron money, the engine money, the steam and tontine money, the raw underground money hidden in unconformable strata, thinly bedded limestone, secret seams and voids, jumbled shales, fire clays, tar and cold measures, to Exeter seeps and springs above the heritage museums and leisure trails, the decommissioned railways, while associated subsidence gnawed quietly away at the superficial architecture of the gorge, peeling the narrow roads slowly off its wooden slopes. The gorge channeled the river, yet was in itself only a sponge, storing vast reservoirs drop by drop in the decaying matrix of history. In town, meanwhile, the newer pavements displayed a tendency to shift and ripple, while at 92 High Street, the three-room basement with its brick barrel vaulting and late 19th century kitchen range began to weep and smell. All through the house, Victoria's newly fashionable chalk paints and distempers yellowed overnight with damp. She sat listening to the rain, the dogs barking next door, the weird buzz of the kitchen fluorescent fitment. There was always a lot of wet coughing outside the front window. Old men, exhausted and complaining as they exchanged the news, turned out to be young men when she looked. Uneasily at first, she returned to the fields behind the town, and a few days later found herself beside the pool where she had last seen her friend Pearl, the waitress. It seemed more extensive now. The wind ruffled its surface, the rain dimpled it. She stared at the tuft of rushes in the centre, nothing. The petals of the submerged flowers looked a little duller. Some sort of mist or vapour was hanging over the woods. Victoria huddled beneath the pylon as if it might provide shelter, struggled with the impulse to take off her shoes and wade into the water. She was trying to fail. She was trying and failing to remember, to admit to what had happened here. But after all, what was there to remember? Things being what they are. People don't walk into a pond as if they are descending the tube station steps on a slow Wednesday afternoon at Oxford Circus. They don't vanish that way when you are watching. Pearl had understood quite well that she was being watched, and not so much by Victoria, who with her pretty latte-coloured car and London stylings had always been less than a player, as by the owner of that voice among the waiting trees. All along, she had been aware of that half-hidden gaze. She had sought its approval, felt and welcomed the weight of it. She had come to the pool that morning to be seen.
Thank you very much for that. And that leads me, I'm going to go into one of our audience questions from Maria, who says, I revere your work for many reasons, but a big one is a feeling that you insist on an older and stranger kind of English myth than what seems to be on offer from more official or nationalist sources. Like PJ Harvey or the Unthanked Sisters for literature. Is that something you do consciously, she asks? Do you dig around for Green Man and other kinds of myths? Is it something you're aware of in thinking about a kind of older English myth?
Great question. It's no longer conscious. I spent a lot of the 70s absorbed by folk music and the academic recording and understanding of folklore at the time. during the 70s. And the Viriconium stories were very consciously based at times on English customs, without stripped of the kind of Victorian and just post-Victorian, and indeed quite some of the, even some of the 50s interpretations of these things, which I felt to be simply not weird enough. When I looked at the material, I thought, my God, this is very strange. You know, this horse's skull under a blanket and these guys singing, that is very strange. And we can make something out of that. And we can make it very weird. And that was the direct and conscious impulse behind Viriconium. That has subsided in me as a conscious thing. But my other intention at the time was to wed that quite deliberately with surrealism and Freudianism and the deep unconscious, the idea of the deep unconscious, but that because it was deep, it would be in all of us. And therefore I should examine my own, and I shouldn't quail at the results that I found there. With the result that Viriconium became weirder and weirder, obviously, as it would. And even a book like Light is heavily influenced by that idea of trying to get some other kind of voice to talk rather than the conscious one. So while, yes, I used to be aware of these things, I'm not so aware now. It's intuitive with me now. It's just a thing I do.
That's very interesting, and it connects. I will try and connect it, make a segue to another question, which is a question from David, who asks whether Mike might share his thoughts on the process of writing about uncertainty with the kind of precision that seems somehow at odds with its subject matter. And that's something I certainly felt in reading this novel. I kept reading little bits aloud to my husband because of their fantastic precision of description. And yet everything is just kind of out of view. And I wonder if you can say something about the process of that balancing act. That's what it feels like to me. Maybe it doesn't feel like a balancing act to you.
It's incredibly difficult. But I think you have to make.
Hear that. I'm relieved to hear that. Thank you.
It's one of the things that I've chased since I was 17. It comes down to looking at things again. You know, the attempt to describe the world, which when I was 17, I naively believed writing was about. That it was that all forms of art were in some way, their purpose was to describe the world. I think you need to make a distinction between that thing whose meaning you don't know and what you actually see. And I think that is that's the distinction that science makes. That scientific epistemologies go, we don't know what this is, so we better look at it very clearly. And when we describe it to one another, we better even have a special language to do that so we know exactly what we mean. And I think, in a sense, for me, squaring the circle has been to run that together or in collision with romantic landscape writing. and that you know when it works, but you don't know how you've done it. Really, I mean, I think that there was a point probably in about 1985 when I understood how I was doing it, and it was stunningly hard to do. But now, again, it's the thing I do, and I wouldn't give it up for the world. To be honest, I think that, you know, a writer like Robert Aikman, who apparently wrote ghost stories, apparently wrote horror stories, had this same technique of looking very directly at the world and then describing what he saw in such a matter as not to explain it. And that's where you get that dichotomy between the apparent clarity with which I am showing you something, and yet a certain lack of meaning or blurriness of meaning to that. And I'm glad everybody notices, and I'm glad people like it, because it's been such hard work to do.
Well, I would, you know, for me, it was the kind of tension that drives the book, is this sense that you're seeing something really clearly, and yet it's all just out of view. So you keep looking and looking. And I was interested when I read this novel, sort of by coincidence. I had just seen, and again, this is one of those things, then when you read your work, you think the world feels like an eerie place, because I had just seen the 1975 film Night Moves, that you refer to in the book, which is a 1975 thriller, where again, for the central detective, who's played by Gene Hackman, he never really seems to understand what's going on.
No. That epistemological failure is what fascinates me. That all horror stories that are any good do that, whether they know they're doing it or not. And most good fantasy isn't sure whether it's doing it or not. But to me, that's the heart of it. The heart of it is to. There's a quote, I can never remember who I'm quoting, but it's like pinned up on my wall, which goes, "There is another world, but it's this one." You know, it's an absolutely a classic situation. I think it is to wake up when you're 8 years old and think, "This is all so odd."
I'd like to ask you, we were talking before we let our audience in, you and I were chatting a little bit about genre. And I mentioned in my introduction your suspicion of the idea of genre, but I'd like you to expand upon that a little bit. You are published, I would say, as a science fiction novelist. This book is published by Gallant, which is thought of as a science fiction imprint. And I wonder how you see the scope of those walls and the breaking down of those walls over the course of your career. And I suppose I like to think, you know, I'm pleased, obviously, that the Goldsmiths Prize, which has a wider reach than many other prizes, I like to think we're looking at a lot of different kinds of books that perhaps, not mentioning any names, other literary prizes don't look at. I wonder what your feelings are about those barriers and the changes in them.
I think it's basically, I've always thought it's a terrible pity that we allowed these barriers to be erected in the first place. I understand the impulse behind them, but I think that they make it very difficult for a writer simply to write, and to look down inside for what's there and not have that modified by the process to fit one category or another. I see absolutely. It's so difficult to talk about because I don't see generic material as generic. That, to me, there's no such thing as a science fiction story or a detective story. They're stories. What you look for when you're reading, or what I look for when I'm reading, is not the similarities between fictions, but the differences between fictions. Night Moves, the detective story you were talking about, that is a detective story which almost resents the basic assumption of the detective story, which is that it can be solved by the detective. And instead it shows the detective in a complete epistemological collapse, absolutely not understanding anything that's going on. You even get the feeling towards the end that nobody else entirely understands it either. And so the outcome is, well, what? It's the vision of the director, it's the vision of the writer. And that seems to me to be what all art is about. In a sense, it's not about writing, well, in fact, it's not even in a sense, it is not about writing into a category. It is about writing. It is about having something to say, saying it, and taking what you need to say it from everywhere. People from the genre often say to me, how do you get your characters so human? Well, I don't, to be honest. I just take a notebook out with me wherever I go, and I write down what I hear people say, and I watch what they do, and I write that down. And I don't invent a character and then hang characteristics on them to make them into a character. I start with a person. That is a difference between writing category fiction and just writing, which I would like to see us all free to do, frankly. And I would like to see us all free to read it. And speaking as a reviewer and a critic, I would like to see us all free to read it, review it, and criticize it. Really, I just finished reviewing Jenny Fagan's new book. She's brought in about 4 different genres into that. It's a magnificent book. It's fantastically readable. It's terrifically funny. It operates at fantastic speed. It covers huge amounts of human territory. Back in the 1960s, everybody would have rejected it because
Yes.
it would have been seen as some sort of chaotic fantasy novel, which it isn't. It's a genuinely literary look at modern existence. I would want to review a book from that point of view. What does it tell me about things? What does it, not what's it trying to say to a particular species of reader, as it were.
And you mentioned another book or another writer that you mentioned when we were talking before, was Daisy Johnson, whose work I like very much. And I reviewed Sisters, which I think is a great book, which you described correctly as it's a horror novel, but it's not published as such, you could argue.
Yeah. Daisy Johnson is a great example of it. So is Julia Armfield. Julia Armfield's short stories. They are simply stories which pull in anything they need to use to make their point, which is, I think, what I'm trying to say, is that you should be allowed to pull it in from anywhere, to construct a world, to construct a kind of inner landscape that makes your point clear to the reader.
Here is a practical question that someone has, which is, because it's always interesting to talk to writers about their actual practical process. Lara would like to know how your writing process has altered in the half a century you've been writing. Has technology helped you, hindered you, not changed anything you've done? What's changed for you kind of technologically in your writing in the last 40 years or so?
The biggest change, and for me the most absolutely worthwhile change, was the advent of cut and paste. The moment I bought an Amstrad, a very early Amstrad, and left it in the packaging for 3 days because I was frightened of it. My partner at the time had to take it out of the box and assemble it. And then Terry Pratchett came around one day and showed me what to do with it. And the moment he did the first cut and paste on it, I thought, thank God, at last, I can do as many drafts as I like, you know? it would, if you actually had to cut and paste a piece of paper and cement strips of it together to look at your work in a different order, you know, paragraph by paragraph, it would take a whole morning to get that done with sellotape and, you know, that stuff that you used to use to ink out typing. I've even forgotten what it was called. All those, all those things you had to do. Now you could do them literally at the touch of a button, and your fingers didn't stop typing while you were doing it. For me, that was a huge, huge step forward. Otherwise, the other big change for me was in the late 70s, starting to use a notebook. Prior to that, I had believed very much in the kind of commercial author's position of the time, which was that you weren't writing unless you were sitting in front of a typewriter, knocking out 18,000 words a day on the novel that you were writing, starting at the beginning and working through to the end. And that was the only definition of writing, basically. And suddenly, in the late 70s, I watched a friend of mine, Judith Clute, she's a painter, and I watched her collect material with a camera in Camden Town on a Saturday morning. And I suddenly thought, I could do that. I wouldn't do it with a camera, I would do it with a notebook. And that changed my way of writing completely. But since those two major changes, I wouldn't say that, you know, much has changed in the praxis. Apart from those habits, you know, where you have to have a certain kind of pen.
I was trying to dissuade my students from those particular kinds of habits, because then you can say, well, I don't have the right pen, I can't do my writing today. So, you know. Exactly.
Never fall into that. Actually, the old commercial writers were right about that. They were exactly right about that. Never do it.
Alex asks, is there a relationship between the deep ancient strangeness you were just describing and your political views? It seems to me, asks this questioner, that anarchism in particular feels deep and ancient, and that it is in perpetual tension with a kind of authoritarianism that also exists in human nature.
I don't know whether I would make it that direct, or that I would ever have made it that direct. I think that, you know, to a degree, every one of us, and all of us as a social unit, are constantly in a dialogue between deep, almost biological, organic drives and feelings, and a more conscious understanding of the consequences of behaviour. And most of my stuff has been about that, but not in a direct way, and not attached to my politics specifically. I think when you do that, you do limit your audience. You limit yourself. This connects to me with the freedom from genre. The freedom from genre means that you can look for exactly what it is you are trying to say, and I think the same is true with politics. That in a sense, you keep your politics for your actions. When you're writing, you're looking to connect them in a much more I don't know whether to say unconscious or semi-conscious way. I'm always looking to make connections that seem to me to be fully and deeply human, as it were, rather than labeled.
I was going to say, because I suppose when you say human at the end, that connects to me, for me, to something you were saying before about the way you observe character and think about how the characters in your books will behave like real people, rather than perhaps imposing a viewpoint, a political viewpoint, that they might need, any kind of viewpoint that they that might serve the story. That's, as I understand what you say, that's kind of the wrong way around for you.
That is. I start with what I've seen. I honestly do try to start with what I've seen. So, and then whether I approve of it or not, I allow it to condemn itself out of its own mouth. And essentially, quite a few of my contemporary short stories, certainly back to 2000, 1995, are quite pejorative of the behaviour of the people, the characters in them. But I didn't start with the idea of doing that. I started with watching people do the things they did and converting that into a fiction. And I still think that's the way to write. Especially if you want to be contemporary, you know, there's nothing like actually listening to what people say to make you a contemporary writer.
Maybe this is a question you can't answer, but let's try. Julia asks, it feels like we are now living in a science fiction book come true in the midst of this pandemic that we find ourselves in. How will you allude to this time in your writing from now on?
Well, probably not directly. I think there are plenty of writers who will do that. What I'll be looking, and also not immediately. I'm used to letting things cook and not knowing what my position with regard to them or my opinion on them is until much later. It'll take me a couple of years, I think, to say anything, but certainly not directly. I think there will be so many, there will be so much writing about all of this that frankly, there'll be nothing that I can add to it. Not directly, obliquely perhaps, and perhaps I can use it for something else. For me, I would be trying to use COVID as a metaphor for something else, rather than to try and encapsulate it in some fictional form.
That was one of the ways in which this novel, I would say, seemed prescient to me, in the sense of disconnection between Shaw and Victoria, and the way in which he doesn't read her emails. And, here we all are now. We're all kind of having this experience of being flung apart from each other. And yeah. It's much harder to connect. And, I was just noticing, I thought, well, I'm reading this in a different way than I would have last year.
Yeah, that was extraordinary, because of course I'd already finished the book quite a long time before COVID. So it was quite a shock to me too, to be thrown into the position of the characters. But especially, I do think Shaw's behaviour is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. He's a complete waste of space, frankly. And while I was writing some of the things he did, including not reading her emails, I was, there were times when I had to stop because I'd become overtly satirical of him, and I didn't want that. I wanted him to be, what you see is what you get. You make your own judgment about Shaw. I don't want to be obviously taking the piss out of this guy, but at the same time, it was it is I think we were used to being separate from one another to one degree or another quite a long time before COVID. And not necessarily because of the internet either. I think that we simply, this is a weird way of putting it, are growing apart from one another. I don't have an opinion about that, whether it's good or bad or whatever, but I have a feeling that somebody from the 20s or 30s of the last century would simply not really understand the society that we now live in. That it would be as much of a puzzle to them as somebody from the 15th century trying to understand what was going on. And I find that fascinating. You should be able to write a kind of retrofit science fiction story that looks back into the past rather than into the future in some way.
We're coming to the end of our time. This has been a wonderful event, but here's a good question, I think, to close with. A while back, Mike mentioned in his blog working on a new book that won't be fiction, but I'm not sure I could ever decide what it is. Our questioner is wondering how it's coming along and whether you can say anything else about it.
Well, it's coming along slowly, which they always do. It's been through, I should explain, it's an attempt to write a book as fragmentary as my journals and notebooks, which I've used the blog as a kind of showcase for those ever since 2007, and what I've taken away from that experience is an understanding that nobody would ever be able to write a biography of me using my notes. They do not seem to refer to a connected set of experiences in any way. That they are as sort of fragmentary as unexplained Polaroid photographs, as it were, of a dead person. And I look at them and I think, well, I can see what I meant by this, but I can't any longer see how it connected to my life. Why did I write this, you know? And I suddenly thought, well, could you write an exploded or deconstructed piece of memoir or autobiography or autofiction or some collision between all those media in such a way that you didn't betray the fragmentary nature of the material? How could you find linkages without them being too obviously linkages, so that you could preserve that fragmentary, flickering sort of nature of the perception that's involved? So I'm trying to do that, basically. So I compiled 150 thou, which I then cut down to 50, and which I'm now trying to cut to 30, so they can then build up from there, hoping that I will have got some kind of structure to work from. At the point of having written 30,000 words, I'll be able to look at it and say, yes, I can see what I'm trying to do here. So it'll take another year or so, I would think, but it's going well and I'm really enjoying it.
That's great.
What will happen to it after that, I don't know. I may just put it in a drawer and leave it there.
Well, we will hope that you will not. A lovely question to have at the end to give us something to look forward to. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us this evening. Congratulations again on winning the 2020 Goldsmiths Prize. I was absolutely thrilled by that, and I look forward to the next and the next. And thank you all for coming this evening. Alas, these events always end rather abruptly in our Zoom era, but I know that we would all be giving Mike a big round of applause. So thank you so much, Mike, and good night, and see you again soon, I hope.
Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Erica. See you soon.
All the best.
Bye-bye.